Good morning. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. I wanted to welcome everybody to day 2 of our Workplace Promise Institute. We had a really wonderful day 1. I just can't thank everybody enough who really helped make yesterday just such a success. And our giraffery night was wonderful. We gave out a few awards, and we actually opened up the mics for just conversation with people, and we got to hear some thoughts and feedback, and so that was really nice, really special. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started for this morning. I see there are still people logging in. I know it's early it's early for some of us on a Friday, I think late in the day for some other people, but I will, because I know we have a lot to cover and we are recording these sessions. They will be available online as soon as we can get everything sorted out. But we are going to have these posted so that we're going to have all the sessions posted so that it can be accessed as soon as we are able. And I'm trying to see, so I think I'm still looking. I can see Kelly. I can't see Brenda or Sylvain.
I'm here.
Oh, you are. Okay.
And now you can see me.
Now I can see you. Yes. It's because of the background, if you're not on screen, I can't even see if you're logged in. And do we have Brenda? Don't see her, and I still see people logging on. Christian, do you see, or can you reach out to Brenda and see where she is?
I shot Brenda an email a few minutes ago.
Okay. All right. Well, so again, I wanted to thank yesterday and the sponsors we have today. We've had just an array of wonderful sponsors, including Whisply, that's sponsored as a silver lever sponsor. We acknowledged all that yesterday. Mahari and Scalat have been our lead donors, and so we're very grateful for them. They were our gold level sponsor, and then of course Whistly was our sponsor at the silver level, and Brenda Wilson from Feds Protection was a bronze level sponsor. We had a few of those. The National Workplace Bullying Coalition has been a sponsor. They have an organization that we've recently partnered with. They are trying to bring legislation to every state to make anti-bullying laws and provide protections from bullying in the workplace. As most of you know, discrimination, harassment, those things are illegal. Bullying is not. And then the David M. Evans law firm has been somebody else we've had a lot of nice collaboration with. And then of course, big thanks to our team at Running Name. That was Paul's voice. You occasionally hear chime in. Paul and his team of interns. I'm very excited that we've had just a group of them who have stepped up, but most importantly, Belpreet Singh, Christina Salazar, and Rachel Cook. They have been amazing. So all the graphics, all the designing, all the social media stuff they've done, and we're really looking forward to a collaboration for 2020 with the Southern Georgia University is going to dedicate a class to working for Whistleblowers of America and doing some of our social media. So I'm very excited about that. So we are going to start our session on compliance, right doing, and truth telling. I want to, we all know that whistleblowing begins with a moral compass and professional ethics that are learned, developed over time. Organizations that facilitate right doing and are dedicated to compliance and continuous process improvement make it easy and encourage whistleblowing. It's a normal part of doing business. Depending upon circumstances, there are merits of filing an anonymous complaint versus going public, and I'm going to ask the panel about some of that today as well. Experts in this area can discuss evidence gathering and proper ways in which to conduct a fair and unbiased investigation that can be trusted and respected by all parties. These are important elements for whistleblower complaints to be substantiated and resolved. Employees seeking compliance and transparency need to understand the difference between audits, investigations, reviews, and recommendations that are binding or not binding, and the best points of contact for raising their concerns. They should know how the process and procedures to follow their disclosures and how to protect themselves and their families from any harm. And then if we get Brenda on, I know she is sort of the expert on insurance coverage and how you might be able to use insurance to cover some of these cases. So compliance is where most whistleblowing begins. So let's start by talking about that. Sylvain, you've been a whistleblower. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience with that, and then why you created Whisply and why you think confidentiality is so important.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for having me. I guess like most whistleblowers, it happened by accident. So you may have picked up my lovely French accent. I'm actually a Frozy French Australian. I'm currently in Sydney, Australia. You can see that in the background here. And been in Australia for 17 years now. But in 2012, I got a job for a large organization with about 50,000 employees in mining, construction, and engineering. And my background is in supply chain and procurement, so definitely not into anything like audit or investigation or compliance. And my role as I guess in charge of part of procurement for that organization was to understand the spend, and so we did a spend analysis and then reviewing some vendors and the spend with those vendors, and I just picked up a few where the name and the spend just seemed a bit fishy to me, and so I digged into a few of them. One of them led me to it was a cottage, so kind of a bed and breakfast or something like this, spending about $2 million in 12 months, and I thought that was a lot of money for probably a couple of rooms, and then found the name of a director on doing a search on Google. Put that name back into the company directory and got a match with an employee who was reporting to the head of finance in that, or the CFO in that organization, and that's when my whole world went upside down. Doing a bit more work with accounts payable, I got to 308 invoices for a total of $20.7 million of company money going down the drain over 12 years. And my first thought was that I had to be wrong because at least 50 to 100 people saw exactly what I saw on those invoices, and no one said nothing. And in our, I guess, the way we've been raised is that the majority is usually correct, and I was new in that company. I'd been there for 2 months. I was on probation. My wife was expecting baby number 3, and for sure I was missing something because I was the newbies on the block. And so the first few hours were just about telling myself that I had to be wrong, and I had to convince myself that that guy who'd been there for 30 years, was 6 months to retirement, reporting to the CFO. He must have been right in doing whatever he was doing. But the more I was digging, and the more I thought, this was definitely not right. And so I had to kind of do something about it. I didn't know what whistleblowing meant at the time. I went onto the intranet of the company looking for something. It took me 30 minutes to find what they call the code of business conduct. In there was a whistleblowing policy, and I got access to 5 intake channels. One was the hotline, which is very popular in the US, and if someone can tell me why, then please do so, because I don't understand. Then I had the fax. Never used the fax in my entire life. Then I had the snail mail, so the PO box. I had the form on the intranet, the email address, and the beautiful talk to your manager or HR. And none of those mechanisms I was comfortable with, because they're either not anonymous or not enabling a two-way conversation. I thought, someone may have sent already the invoices through the mail, and maybe no one picks it up, or maybe the person that picks it up doesn't know what to do with it and then throw it in the bin. Calling someone in a call center was not really what I wanted to do, because I wanted to tell my company. I didn't want to tell a third party, because if I was ever wrong, then my company would come back to me saying, this is wrong, and how come you say that to a third party? So all of those channels were kind of scary to me. Of course, I've got a bit of an accent, so there were probably 5 froggies in that company at the time. So calling someone in a call center would have potentially identified myself within seconds. And at the end of the day, I did what I would recommend everybody else not to do, which is to talk to my manager. And the reason why I did it was because I trusted her. She'd been there for 5 months. She's the one that hired me 2 months before, and she couldn't be part of that fraud scheme. And so I went to her office and said, Visna, this is what I see on those invoices. Can you tell me if you see the same thing? Within minutes, she understood. She went to the office of the managing director of that company, who happened to be in the same building. And the next day, the guy was interviewed by HR. A few months later, he cooked 15 years behind bars. In the meantime, the company asked me if I wanted to become a pseudo investigator. And I said, guys, I've got no clue what you're asking me to do, but it sounds a lot of fun and I'll do it. And so they gave me the keys of the company, and I was able to sniff around and do kind of what an investigator does, or more of an auditor job. And I did that for 2.5 years. And it was a great, company to learn, because of the nature of the business. Being in mining and construction and engineering, there was a lot of stuff happening. And so, yes, we were losing, millions of dollars every year to fraud and corruption, but it was kind of the norm, I guess, mostly in some countries. But the worst was not the loss of money. The worst was actually the impact that this was having on the good people. People were calling in sick, doing the 9 to 5. Turnover was going through the roof. Productivity was fairly low, only because those individuals were looking, the handful of rotten apples doing the wrong thing, and that kind of destroyed the company culture. And so for me, the conclusion was that as a company, we actually failed to leverage our best asset, our greatest asset, which are our people that we pay every day. And most of them, the vast majority, they actually come to work to do something good, and to enjoy, their daily life at work. And we just kind of put a Band-Aid on their face and said, don't speak up, because we give you channels that aren't really suitable for you to use. And this is when I realized I could do better. And so I left the corporate world and started the company the very next day. And that's how Whisply is born. And the whole idea of Whisply is to enable what we call trusted conversations. So it's to help people, have conversation on or difficult and courageous conversations on difficult topics. And it doesn't have to be fraud and corruption, because as soon as you isolate fraud and corruption, or if you ask people, what whistleblowing is, most people don't have a definition, or we all have our own definition. And for me, I guess when I started the company, the idea was to say nobody wants to be a whistleblower. So what's the point of actually building a whistleblowing platform or whistleblowing tool, because nobody wants to be one. And this is what I guess helped us build a platform that enables those trusted conversations by making it easier for people to engage in those conversations. So they can be anonymous. They can do it like they do on WhatsApp. Every time they start a new conversation, the system will give them a new avatar. So it can be the blue apple or the pink pizza or something like this. And that makes things a lot easier. And what I say as well is, when we ask people to speak up today, it's like when we ask you to drive a car for the first time in your life. It's very scary. If you imagine what it was like for those of you who have your driver license, everything changes suddenly. You've got, the pedestrian crossing, you've got the dog crossing the road, you've got the traffic lights, you've got someone screaming in your ears, probably a police officer somewhere, the speed limit, and all of that is very, very, very scary. But the more you drive, and the more it becomes the norm, and up to the point that when you get into a car these days, you probably don't ask yourself whether you're going to be driving the car or be the passenger of the car, because it's kind of the same. And that's what whistleblowing should be all about. But we make it very, very hard for people to speak up. And so the whole idea behind, Whisply is to actually make it kind of business as usual to engage in those trusted conversations, whether it's about fraud, corruption, harassment, discrimination, COVID and work from home, or domestic violence, or a safety near miss in the office. All of these topics are, for me, difficult and courageous conversation that people should have. And if you make it too special, if you make it something that's hidden on the internet that you will never use until you pick up a $20.7 million fraud, then yes, very few people will use it because it's too scary. But if you can make sure that people have access to that tool, from their Microsoft Teams or Zoom or their inbox, and it's readily available, then they'd be more tempted to use it. And then I guess the last piece of the puzzle is it's still too hard for people to speak up. So the way you can get people to speak up is by actually asking them the questions. So it could be, have you been subject to some type of bullying at work? Yes or no? And if you can ask them those questions through an app or a system, and let the employees answer anonymously, and then depending on the answer, going back to them and offer help, then you've got a better chance of them engaging with you. So it's all about kind of, I guess, reinventing whistleblowing or a speak up program by making it super easy for people to come forward. So I guess it took me a few minutes, but that's kind of what we do.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the background on the story and who you are and how you even got to make the leap to Whisply. I think is important to understand, and I think we definitely will need to talk more about this idea of remaining anonymous or being sort of exposed in your whistleblowing, or very public in your whistleblowing, and what are the pros and cons of that. But first I wanted to ask Kelly to tell us a little bit about the podcast she runs and to share some of the highlights and the lessons learned she has had in documenting fraud.
So thank you so much, Jackie. Jackie was one of my first guests on Great Women in Fraud, and even though it's called Great Women in Fraud, I do have, as I call it, Great Dudes in Fraud for the podcast. But it's basically to help people who are interested in fraud, as someone who works in fraud, someone who's been a victim of fraud. It's kind of just to help people add something to their tool belt. My story, I've been an investigator, and I did use an alert line, and it didn't go well for me. So I didn't do it anonymously because there was nothing to be anonymous about. However, I will tell anyone who uses an alert line, and I hate to say this, is you need legal counsel. And I see that some of your sponsors are lawyers, and had I gone to a lawyer before I'd done the alert line, maybe I wouldn't be here today, but actually I'd want to be here today because this is the best work I'm doing. So everything happens for a reason. I loved Sylvain's story that, no one says as a child, I'm going to grow up and be a whistleblower. Like, it just doesn't happen. I mean, but it's so incredibly important because according to the ACFE and in my work, how do we find fraud? Kind of by accident or by tips. And if you don't have a mechanism for people to do it, then we're not going to get those. My biggest cases have come via tip and anonymously. So while I didn't do it anonymously, I think that, a lot of people need to do it anonymously for a lot of different reasons. I did a presentation a couple of years ago, and there was a lawyer who got up and did a presentation, and he's the employer side lawyer. So the first thing he says is, I always try and find out who the whistleblower is. And I wanted to scream. I was like, why? Why is that important? Why is the whistleblower important instead of the act important? It needs to be the act. And yeah, you're going to get people who use the alert line for nefarious purposes. I mean, I worked with someone who I know she used it 3 times on 3 different people because of her agenda. So, but when a lawyer gets up there for the employer side and says the first thing that we need to do is to find out who the whistleblower is, I want to scream. I don't know, Sylvain, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's definitely the wrong thing to do. And for me, I think companies, at least for the one that I'm interacting with, they usually start to think as whistleblowers kind of the enemies, the troublemaker. But the more they learn about the value that they bring to the company, the more they want to receive those reports. But there's still a minority of those companies to date because I guess of history and a few cases that may have been very public and companies fear about whistleblowers. But you've got those companies that actually measure the number of reports they get every year, and they want that number to be as high as possible. And that's when you think that those guys get it, or those ladies, for that matter, because there's also a lot of women in those positions. And I think it's really important to realize that there's for me the I guess the people that will speak up with I guess bad intentions, they're not whistleblowers, they're troublemakers, yes, but there's far more true valuable resources there in your companies that do want to help to get things moving in the right direction, to protect the interest of the company, to protect their colleagues and themselves, that want to do that for the right thing, and they're true whistleblowers. I think it's the tide is moving in the right direction. It will be probably another few decades before it becomes the norm. But I think a lot of companies out there realize now the potential behind their human capital, and the fact that when they speak up, whether it's about something that could be around going back to the office because of COVID, or because of a potential safety near miss, and they're not sure if it is or not. Or in my case, it was simply about saying, hey, I saw those invoices, can you tell me if they're okay or not? And give me the option to remain anonymous, because I'm actually not sure. They look very dodgy, but I'm new here, I don't know. That's just what I wanted, was validation. I don't want to, I didn't want that guy to go to jail, to be honest. I felt really bad about that. And that's why I struggled to also speak up. But I didn't want to be a troublemaker. I didn't want that guy to go to jail. I just wanted the fraud to stop, because in that 12-year period, the company was not always doing well, and we had to lay off the people, and that guy was still taking his check every 2 weeks, and I thought that was not right. So anyway.
No, I appreciate this conversation, and I love what Kelly said about nobody wakes up and says, oh, today I'll be a whistleblower. When as a child, you don't aspire to grow up to do this. And so in my experience, the day I walked into a senior person's office and said, hey, let me explain the background of this problem, never it occurred to me that even at that moment in time that I was being a whistleblower. I thought I was identifying a conflict of interest. And again, we're talking about suicide prevention money. So there were literally lives at stake. I mean, what we did at a high level had a trickle down impact. And I thought, well, if we're misappropriating the money, or we're not spending it correctly, or we're mismanaging, we are going to cost people their lives in the long run. So when I walked into his office and I said, this is what's going on, I said, I was done. I thought I did what I was supposed to do, what every company tells me to do, all our training said, this is a conflict of interest. This is a violation of the federal acquisition regulation. And I had that in my head. I cited that. I said, this is what's going on. And he picked up the phone. He called my supervisor, who at the time was a 3-star general. So you can imagine this is at high levels in the Pentagon. And I really honestly thought we were done. And it never occurred to me that I needed to be anonymous. It never even occurred to me that I'd been a whistleblower. The first time somebody called me a whistleblower, I was like, no, wait, what? And it was as this sort of started to unravel, and I was losing my job, and I was being moved. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, yes, of course they knew this was me. I mean, and so it was already too late in the game for me to go, oh, I want to be anonymous, or I thought. So what are your thoughts about being confidential versus being anonymous, or being in public versus being anonymous?
I'm happy to jump in because I've got, I guess, a strong opinion there. I guess it depends on the situation. It depends on the individual. But for me, the option to be anonymous should be there. It's not because we want to hide. It's because we want to build trust. We want to know what the other party is going to say. We want to see if we're, potentially vulnerable or not. And in my personal, very selfish situation, if I had the opportunity to be anonymous, it was just to say, hey, this is what I saw, tell me if it's right or wrong, because I truly didn't know. I didn't want to look stupid because I was, still on probation. And this was potentially very, very big, but there was a slim chance that this was actually a fraud, because otherwise someone else would have picked it up over that 12-year period. I was not, a rocket scientist or anything like this. I was just a normal dude going to work every day. And so for me, anonymity, would have been important to, I guess, remove a lot of the stress that I went through, and the courage that I had to find somewhere deep inside myself to go and tell someone, like, am I stupid, or is this really what I'm looking at is fraud? So I think it's more about helping people to build trust. I guess for others, it might be about protecting themselves, because they know that whoever is doing the wrong thing could be highly powerful in that institution or organization, and they could potentially lose their job or worse sometimes. And I think the option should be there. Even when we're working with actually law firms that use the platform to let people engage in conversation, while those law firms actually protect whistleblowers. But some whistleblowers fear about speaking to a lawyer because they don't know what's going to happen when they do that. So I guess it's all about building that connection and trust, and for the other party to show, what they're going to do and how they're going to manage the information and what's going to happen next. And then if I feel comfortable, I can give away my name. And that's why, when we built Whisply, for instance, we allow the employee or the individual to, of course, report anonymously if they want to do that, and then they'll be protected by the avatar. But at any point in time, they can decide to say, hey, I'm Sylvain, and this is what I discovered, if they feel comfortable to do that. But I guess it's to the individual to decide. And then there's other scenarios, like when you talk about sexual harassment, for instance. Of course, you might not go and interview a so-called perpetrator until you've seen the victim. But again, it could take weeks or months before that victim is willing to actually come forward. And whether that victim wants to go to the company or maybe a doctor or someone else outside of the company, I think the organization should provide those options, just to make sure that they show empathy and give all of the options to the potential victim, and for that victim to find the courage at any point in time to go and seek help. But they shouldn't have to pick up the phone and say, hey, I was raped by my boss last night. It's never going to happen. And that's why I'm really angry with hotlines, is because you can't outsource trust. You can't give that away to an external third party with a bunch of people in a call center. And yes, I know some people might still be willing to call someone and not to type something on a keyboard or a smartphone. But I think there's better ways to build trust these days than calling a stranger in a call center.
Yeah. So, and Kelly, do you have a strong opinion about any of this?
So, a couple of years ago, I got to see Eugene Soltis, who wrote the book. He's a Harvard professor, Why They Do This. Yeah. He was doing a lot of work on whistleblowing, and it's a conference. It's fun, and he was doing a study, and like one of the things that they asked was, like, someone used the alert line or the hotline, whatever you want to call it, and that they like called in, and it was able to track the number. And it was just like, it was almost hilarious, but it wasn't hilarious. Or they responded back to the whistleblower and said, we need your corporate email address to be able to respond to you. And it's like, again, no one wants to get up and cause problems. I mean, most people don't want to get up and cause problems. And so to make it an easy process that you're not scared of, like, it just, it's so important that you have that trust. And you said that, a couple of times, Sylvain, is about the trust, that, you have to have it. And unfortunately, a lot of times we don't have it. Right. And, the other thing is, and you said this also, it's great to have a lot of, activity on the alert line. And I'll get someone who will say, oh, we've had no calls on the alert line. It's like, yeah, that's because retaliation. And retaliation is real. I mean, it absolutely is real. And so I really think the education part of the alert line or hotline, which obviously you're doing, Sylvain, is so incredibly important.
No, I appreciate that. And I think the, you know, I'm mindful of the fact that we had a group of attorneys on this call or on this Zoom meeting yesterday for the conference. And I know I've had this discussion, and attorneys will always tell you, be anonymous, be anonymous, be anonymous. But then on the flip side, I've had people say that, you know, especially government employees who use an OIG hotline, and you file that little form. If you're anonymous, one, they don't investigate. Like, let's be honest about that. If they don't have anybody to interview or contact, or they just don't open cases. I've had IGs behind closed doors tell me, look, if you're anonymous, we don't even know where to begin to interview people. So, you know, I mean, they don't develop the evidence themselves. It's always incumbent.
You see, Jackie, for me, this is kind of the, I guess, 90s mentality where, yes, anonymity meant someone's put a letter under my door, or they put in a call and, you know, we're changing their voice and there's no way to actually go back. And yes, that was nice in the 90s, but like we're in 2021 and that technology allows to be anonymous, but also have a kind of a WhatsApp type conversation, not having to disclose who I am. But you'll know that you're actually interacting with a real human being, and it's not. And if I feed the company or the organization with evidence, potentially in some instances, like, you know, a fraud like the one I uncovered, there was no need to have my name on a report. You know, I was just giving them, I guess, the invoices. They could have done the work that I've done in 5 minutes and sort it out. And I guess there's many of those instances where the whistleblower just happened to stumble onto a piece of information. You know, anyone else could have done the same thing. It just happened that it was, you know, that person, and the only thing they have to do is to kind of hand over with a bit of background, and they've got nothing to do with that story, and they shouldn't be, you know, they shouldn't have to actually disclose their identity. So I guess nowadays, an organization, whether a government agency or a private organization or not-for-profit, that says, we will not investigate anonymous reports, I think they're just ignorance. They're just burying their head in the sand. Yes, if you do that with the clunky reporting channels that were available, you know, 20 years ago, I guess you're probably right. It's harder to investigate and you waste a lot of time. But nowadays, technology allows to, I guess, respect the reporter and allow those individuals to be anonymous for as long as they wish to be anonymous. And then in some instances, you know, it might just be that, hey, if you want to get help, or if you want us to go and, you know, interview that so-called perpetrator, we'll need to know who you are. So we'd like you to come and see, I don't know, Jackie in the HR department, or Kelly who is a doctor or whatever, and we'll give you all of the options. We'll cover the cost, but we can't go and just, you know, accuse someone without knowing if, you know, you're who you said you are. So I guess, but allowing for anonymity, at least in the first instance, I think for me is a must.
So Sylvain, I have a quick question. When the guy was caught and went to, you know, prison, were you around to see, like, people were like, I knew something was up? Or do you think other people had that sort of sense?
No, I think like that guy had a normal life, and that's the thing is, for me, I actually feel for that guy. You know, I don't think he deserved to take 15 years behind bars, to be honest, because I think for me he was sick, you know, where he did that and he went into that vicious circle. He couldn't get out, but he didn't spend the money buying, you know, a fancy jet or buying a massive mansion. What he did was very futile and stupid. He blew up all of the money, by the way, but not in anything kind of smart. But I feel for that individual, and no one had a clue, even his wife, even his daughter. And that's the thing is, when he got arrested, he went into the police station where his son-in-law to be, because his daughter was about to get married. And his son-in-law was or is a police officer. He got arrested in that police station. Like, the whole thing was, and everybody was surprised. Even in the organization, no one had a clue that this guy was doing all of that. He was giving a bit of money to charity, but everything else was kind of hidden. Even his wife didn't know that he was, you know, spending that money in prostitutes and call girls and racehorses and and stupid stuff. So it was a surprise for a lot of people in the organization, for sure. And no one had any doubt. Like, a lot of people in that organization knew there was stuff happening, but not specifically with that individual.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think you raised an interesting point about who are these perpetrators and what are their motivations when they commit corruption or fraud, or try to cover up wrongful deaths. I mean, we hear about all kinds of fraud, waste, and abuse, discrimination, harassment in the workplace. Is to really understand who the perpetrators are, how many of them are there. Like in your case, it was just one guy, but how many people were complicit or co-conspirators? I mean, sometimes these cases get pretty big. So, I mean, Kelly, you talk to a lot of people who are certified fraud investigators. What are some of the best practices, or I mean, how does this go right? I mean, where are if you're and I know I've talked to a lot of people who are victims of retaliatory investigations. So how does this go right?
How does this go right? I want to say, and this goes back to Sylvain, it's all about culture and tone at the top. And, it also takes me back to the Uber story where Susan, and I'm spacing on her last name, she tried to do the right thing. And, unfortunately at the top, there was, the CEO who had power, and she went outside, and it cost the company literally billions of dollars in market share. So is good for this. It's really, really hard to, as an investigator, to get it pushed away. Like, there is nothing more frustrating as an investigator to, validating a claim and then saying, well, really, it's not a big deal. And, you've worked hard. And also, I'm going to say that even if it's anonymous, I mean, I had a case where it was anonymous, but we figured out who it was just because they wanted to stay in contact. And based on the information they were feeding us, we figured it was an outside contractor. But you build trust with those victims. And I mean, I feel for them. I absolutely feel for them. So you can't be talking out of both sides of your mouth. It is hard as an investigator when you get shut down and you have to go back to the person and say, I'm sorry, nothing's going to happen. In one case, nothing's going to happen except for the fact that it eventually will crash. And in that case, it did eventually crash. So it's hard as an investigator because these are people. And like you say, Sylvain, even the guy who, stole the money, good people can make a bad choice. And I like how you said he spent it on, women and prostitutes and stuff like that. Well, men steal for wine, women, and wagers. So that kind of fits right into it.
Very true. But yeah, I think in his case, or at least the position I was in when I blew the whistle was kind of, I felt that I was standing in front of him with a gun in my hand and I had the power to pull the trigger or not. It was kind of that bad, I felt really sick before I spoke up, because I knew that if I was right, the consequence would be terrible for him, for his family. And I guess the worst in my own story is that I actually spoke to that guy. They were 52,000 employees in that company. I'd been there for 2 months, but my first job was to actually interview the people that were doing procurement activity, and he was one of them, because in one part of Australia they didn't have a procurement officer, and he was the guy in charge. So I interviewed probably 50 people, and he was one of them. I just didn't remember until I saw his name popping up on the screen. And I knew a bit of his story because every night we're doing a debrief with the team, and my boss was telling us about that guy and the fact that he was married and he had a daughter that was about to get married. So for me, it was becoming kind of not personal because I didn't know him personally, but I knew about him and his life, and I knew that if he was really committing that crime, that he would go to jail. So it was tough, and no one offered help. And I think we talked about that topic yesterday in the conference, but I think supporting the whistleblowers when those things happen and offering some type of psychological support or mental health support is very important. Luckily, a strong family, and I went through that okay, but no doubt some people, I guess, can be heavily impacted for the rest of their lives because it's a massive decision. And a lot of people ask me, like, Sylvain, why did you do it? Like, you didn't have to do it. Maybe other people knew about it and never spoke up. Like, why did you do it? And for me, it was clear. It was I had 2 kids and I've got 3 now, and I want my kids to be good citizens of the world. And if daddy is not telling the truth and speaking up, then I can't expect my kids to do it. It was as simple as that. So it was kind of that inner force that just said, just jump and do it. You'll deal with the consequences no matter what happened. You'll deal with it, but at least you've got that peace of mind that you've done the right thing. But yes, there's always a risk when you speak up.
Well, I love June's comment in the chat. The fundamental flaw in whistleblowing hotlines is that employees in the judiciary assume that businesses are ethical, and there's the term business ethics. They're like, is it an oxymoron?
Yeah.
Because I mean, at the end of the day, I'm going to say until recently, even though it still is, the businesses see their responsibility is to the shareholders in the United States. That is their fiduciary responsibility, is to the shareholders. And there's a conflict there, like that it is a conflict. So I kind of think, it goes back to the Ford Pinto, or for, an $11 fix, and they didn't do it. So.
Well, but that's where I think whether it's shareholders or taxpayers, those are the, those are the silent victims sometimes in all of this. They don't know that their money is being wasted on fraud, waste, and abuse. I mean, if you harass or discriminate one person in your organization and the organization then lets you get away with it, then you've actually harassed and discriminated against everybody that organization touches, because their culture has allowed it and it has permeated. And I think that's where some of the whistleblowers feel this moral obligation to act as you see the greater harm, or you worry that there's a greater harm. I mean, I think Sylvain said it earlier. I had to weigh the one perpetrator against, well, here are all these other employees that are getting laid off, and the company is losing money to do the good things the company is supposed to do, because this one guy who you can have sympathy for, maybe he was, he had an addiction, a disease, whatever reason he was doing it for, he was taking away from that. And I've talked to other whistleblowers who've had to balance out, knowing that they're either putting themselves and their families at risk, other employees, because if there's fraud and they're overpaying or especially like when companies overbill the federal government, well, that means they're putting a lot more people on contract that they don't really need on contract, but that is somebody's job. So if you report it and those people get terminated, then you've got to live with that as well. So there's a lot, I think, when people think about fraud, there's a lot of dissecting the outcome of reporting that fraud. I think that goes through people's minds.
Yeah, but for sure, there's one thing that we'll never do is kind of judge a person for not speaking up, because I think it's so hard, and the personal circumstances make it that, I was able to speak up because, yes, I could have lost my job, but no one would have killed me. Like in Australia, they don't do that. We're not like in some countries in Africa, or where they would not hesitate to kind of, bury you under the ground just so you don't speak up. So I think that was not a threat. Losing my job could have been a threat, and yes, it would have been a bugger, because it was a great job. The pay was great, and my wife was pregnant, so having job security was important. But I'm educated. I've got a good diploma. I can find a job if I have to. And I think that story, because I'd been there for 2 months, I would have not put that on my CV, and I could have found another job. So I think I was kind of safe in that way. So for me to speak up was not about myself or my life or my family and being impacted. I think it was more about doing the right thing. And yes, there was a risk to it, but it was manageable for me. But I can understand that for maybe other people in that organization that probably may have been aware of that guy's activity, it was just too hard, because for them it was their livelihood. You know, maybe they were only a few years, you know, to retirement, and losing that job means, you know, I'm not going to find another job. So and also the impact with their peers and colleagues that they've been working with for so many years. So I guess it's very personal. And in my case, yeah, we can't judge whether people, I guess, are willing to speak up or not.
Well, and you Google the term whistleblower, and you know, you put it in the Google machine, and all the words are negative. It's snitch, rat, tattletale. You know, and we're taught as young children, like, you know, don't tattle, and it isn't tattling. I mean, long term, it's a better thing to do for the business. And until businesses understand that long term, I mean, you know, you're going to have the one-offs that are using the line for nefarious purposes, but no one, again, wants to like have their livelihood taken away from them. And like you, Sylvain, you had a good job. Like, you know, I had a good job. Most whistleblowers like their work, and they see something that doesn't make sense. Or they're, again, back to like the Uber example, something happens to them and it's unacceptable. Yeah, I just, the retaliation, and Jackie, your paper that you did about whistleblowers and PTSD, it is so spot on. You talk to anyone who is, you know, used the alert line, the feelings and the emotions that they go through, it's horrific.
So Kelly, I wanted to ask you to, I wanted to move into the idea of witnesses and the people who support you. How do people develop, or how do investigators know what is a good witness, a bad witness? I mean, how do you get around? Because I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, they never interviewed my witnesses. So why would that be? And how do you really create a good list of witnesses?
I mean, I think some of it is having a spidey sense and just being incredibly curious, like how it could happen, who could have been there. The list of witnesses is so important. Like I did background investigations for federal security clearances, much like you had, Jackie. And it's funny, you put it on your SF-86 references. Well, we never use those references, we develop them. So asking really good questions and again, it's having that empathy. Like if you don't have the empathy, no one's going to open up to you. So I go back to empathy all the time. It's hard when you have to go back to someone and say, I can't go any further. So I mean, most investigators, and I know that like all my guests on Great Women in Fraud, one of their biggest things is curiosity. How could it happen? Like timelines are so incredibly important. So who was at that meeting? Or, you know, we're just, I say as investigators, we're just incredibly curious people, but curiosity with a sense of empathy, but also with like details. Like one little detail might unravel a whole other part of it that you think is not important. I had one manager at one point, terrible taking notes. I'm like a prolific note writer, and I've gone back to notes and say, wait, I didn't talk to that one person. So I'm going to say the curiosity, but also the empathy and the trust. They have to be able to trust you. If you interview someone and they don't feel a sense of trust and potentially empathy with you, they're not going to say, maybe you should talk to this person. This person was in that meeting. Or, you know, maybe this person left kind of quietly. We never understood why. If you're not approachable and non-judgmental, you're not going to get anywhere as an investigator. And I say that.
I guess those witnesses could be potential whistleblowers later. But if you shut them down, or if you shut down the whistleblower by saying, "Hey, sorry, I can't help," you know, don't expect anyone to speak up anytime soon. And word goes around really quickly in a company as well. So that's why I think it's really open. It's really important to be open and show empathy. That's for sure. And not make not rush to conclusion as well.
Absolutely.
No, I appreciate that, because I think that the, one of the things I've asked people, or they've said, oh, nobody interviewed my witnesses. And I said, well, do you have any, like a statement in writing from that witness? Did you ask them to write you a letter, sign an affidavit? Like, how do you collect your witnesses?
You know, I end my podcast and I end my interviews with, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to tell me? Something kind of along those lines. It's kind of that catch-all.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes you're so focused on one path and they're wanting to get something in. And so that sort of catch-all, like, is there anything I haven't asked you, or anyone that you think, you know, I should talk to? Always leave it really open-ended.
Oh, I think you just froze up. We lost you for a second there.
Oh.
No, all good. I think it was you, Jackie. I think I couldn't hear you, Kelly. All good.
Oh, okay. I apologize.
Yeah, people, you know what? People observe a lot more than you think they do. They notice. You just have to give them the opportunity to tell you what they've noticed.
No, I think that's that is probably good advice, and trying to figure out how these investigations happen. And then I know you've probably talked to people who've said, well, as soon as I filed my complaint, they opened an investigation, but they opened up the investigation against me. And Tom Devine has called that the retaliatory investigation. What has been your experience with people who have had to go through that? And how do you, now you're focused on defending yourself as opposed to the wrongdoing?
It's so wrong on so many levels. And again, it goes to your article on the PTSD. When, you know, I mean, you talk to someone who this has happened to, they second guess everything. Like, you know, why did I do it? And you can't unring that bell. It's really, really hard to unring that bell. And you put them on the defensive. So then are they going to offer you up anything else? And maybe their part of it is only this small, but now you've opened them up to this, when really the whole, it's, again, going back to that attorney who says, I always try to find out who the whistleblower is. It's like, you need to investigate the acts first. And there's a woman attorney over in London who worked for the Serious Fraud Office, and she said it so well: investigate the acts first. Eventually, sure enough, you're going to have to investigate, you know, depending where, if it gets into the courts and stuff like that, yeah, you're going to have to do the due diligence on that person.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to look at the acts before you look at the person.
So is it common then, would you say, that the whistleblower does get investigated just because they had the knowledge?
I mean, I don't know if I'm going to say it's common. I'm gonna say that it can happen easily if you don't kind of stop and think about it. And I loved what it's Lloydette by Williams of the I'm totally spacing on the name of her company. She's in London. If you don't stop yourself and say, we need to look at the acts before we look at the person.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yes, I think that's the desire of every whistleblower, is that what they get reported is what will be investigated, not them as the reporter.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, with social media and just the quick connections that we have, it's really easy to just say, well, let's take a look at this person. Like, what was their beef? Like, it shouldn't be what was their beef. It mm-hmm. should be, what did they see that was wrong?
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's why, unfortunately, I mean, I never say, never want to tell people you need legal counsel, but you really need legal counsel to do this. Jackie, looking back at your experience, you know, you just walked in and you told them. If you could redo it, If you could redo it, would you have gone and spoken to a lawyer first?
Probably. I wanted to find somebody else who knew something about something, and that's where I started to go, oh, it was like a behind, sort of behind closed doors conversation. What do you think about this? What should I do? And I had gone to somebody I trusted, a friend in the organization, who happened to have access to this very senior person. And she was the one who said, you got to talk to Jackie. And she knocked on the door and she escorted me in. And as she was turning to leave, I grabbed her arm and I said, come with me. And that turned out to be one of the best things I did, because the person I made my disclosure to, unbeknownst to me at the time, had cancer. And before anybody interviewed him, before any of this case went any further, he died. And so nobody ever got him on the record in terms of what disclosure did I make to him, what actions did he take. We had to kind of piece it together around the fact that he couldn't really speak for himself. But I mean, in my heart, I know he believed me. I was still sitting there. Nobody knows, or no, up until now, nobody knew that I was actually with this other witness, that we were sitting there when he picked up the phone and he promised me he was going to deal with this. And to my knowledge, he did. And again, like I said, I thought I was done, but I made that disclosure feeling like I was in a very safe place to make that disclosure, walked in the door, never filed anything anonymously. Although later on, when I went to the DoD OIG twice, gave them the case, and both times, the first time they told me, oh, you don't need to come to the OIG, you need to go to OSC. So I went to OSC, and OSC didn't care about the disclosure. They only cared about the retaliation. And then by the time I went to the DoD OIG again, that person was no longer at the agency. So they said, we don't open investigations on people who no longer work here. And they sent me away. So twice I went to the OIG, and twice never got them to open a case. So that's why, some of my experiences with the OIG is that it could be a rather frustrating process to know when they're going to open, and OSC as well, when are they going to open investigation and when are they going to interview witnesses. And if it wasn't, and at one point I did have an attorney, she was the one who said, well, get these people in writing, because by then the leader that I had come to had died. She was like, well, let's get as many people in writing about what they know and what they saw. And that was really helpful because it gave me something that kept moving the case forward, that I did make a disclosure. There were witnesses to it. Even though the person I reported said, oh, I had never any idea that I had made any of those reports. And then everybody else that was involved, I don't remember, I don't recall, no, I wasn't there, I don't know how that happened. There was just a lot of denial, but the fact that I did make a disclosure and there was a witness to it was the one thing that kept hooking my case forward.
Well, that's another thing, is these cases take so long. Yeah. Like there is no 1 hour television whistleblower. And so if it's not anonymous, or you have a way to, communicate with the person who reported it, to keep them apprised of it, because like the one case where it was quote anonymous, but we kind of knew, we had, a way to be able to communicate with them. It was really important for the person to understand we were moving along. So, people don't understand quite how long it takes. Mm-hmm. And, to set expectations as the investigator, never promise. Because unless I'm the investigator that's at the top of the heap of a company and that doesn't happen, you can't promise an outcome, unfortunately. Even though that outcome should happen, you can't promise or guarantee.
Yeah, but it's important to, I guess, provide feedback as much as you can, like during the investigation, because it can last, a few days or a few years, but you never know how long it's going to last. So And that's why it's important to have that two-way conversation as much as possible. And going back to your question, I guess, Kelly, to Jack, it's interesting because when you ask whether you would have, seek legal advice if you had to do it all over again, you're still not 100% sure. But what I think when you're in the midst of it, because you stumble onto something, you never think it's going to be a big deal. Like it's
Right.
just that little piece that you pick up, and that little piece become bigger and bigger by the minute, and then it's kind of too late to any action. And it'd be interesting to see if nowadays there's actually more people seeking legal advice than 10 years or 20 years ago. I'd be curious to get the data, but I don't think it has changed that drastically because, again, you're not born thinking you're going to become a whistleblower and you're just waiting for that day to happen. Quite often, and I think, Jackie, you realize that as well, is we realize we're whistleblowers way after the fact. And that was my case as well, like, because I had no clue what a whistleblower was, to be honest. And so I think we can't expect that people will just naturally go and seek legal advice every time they pick up a little something, because we pick up little somethings every day. But sometimes that little something is going to become a massive fraud or a massive event. So I think it's more about raising awareness of picking up red flags and being aware of even like we talk about legislations, and there's a lot of changes around the world. Around whistleblower legislation, and I always say, those legislations, they're useless to the whistleblowers because they'll never know about the legislation in their country. And even if I was, let's say, working in France, but I work for an American company, I wouldn't have a clue which legislation, applies to myself. And by the way, if I'm an employee or a contractor or a former employee or a supplier, maybe that legislation doesn't apply because they're so complex. However, they're great to actually force the organization to start to put some, systems in place. So I think in that sense, they're very important, but don't expect whistleblowers or employees to know the whistleblowing legislation in their country that applies to them, because they'd have no clue. And even if they knew, they would still be worried about, oh, does that apply in that case? Because my company is not, it's from the US or from Australia or from whatever. So,
no, I think that's a good point. And I see June Bellamy is in attendance today. I know her and I have talked about this. So she worked for a company, Samsung, and based in Korea. She worked and lived in South Africa. So, how do you get, and if Korea has better whistleblower laws than South Africa, how do you maybe get those laws to apply to your case as opposed to these laws? Like, how do you figure out, if you start reporting internally, shouldn't it follow the same sort of chain of compliance, or does it switch then to the local laws of the local country? I mean, I think that's tricky.
And this is a little bit maybe not off topic, but really, really timely, is right now we have the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos trial going on. Yeah. And that case is, Tyler Schultz is the whistleblower. I've seen him present in person. I also, the young woman, and I'm basing on her name. And I think of the Wirecard case with Dan McCrum at the Financial Times, retaliating as a big corporation against people like that is horrific. Dan McCrum's story is chilling. And I believe Theranos allegedly spent $300 million on lawyers and investigators for intimidation purposes. Goes to therapy. It goes to having a person, a trusted person. I can't imagine how many people don't have the resources, don't have the support that something like this happens to, and they might just go away in the middle of the night, but it affects them for the rest of their lives, I'm going to say. Tyler Schultz came forward. Dan McCrum came. There are so many that have come forward that had support, but think of how many don't have support. And that's just frightening to me.
Yeah, I mean, we get cases like that every single day where people are, feeling alone, isolated. I'm out on a limb. Nobody understands me. Nobody knows what I'm going through. But I had to do what I felt like I had to do, or I did what I was ethically trained to do. And now all of a sudden, my life is falling apart. And then you don't let go. I mean, you have no choice but to then fight for your integrity. And so this retaliation and these retaliatory investigations, and I love what you said, Kelly, about actually hiring lawyers and this defamation. I mean, these things are tactics done on purpose. They are not by accident, and they are meant to undermine, malign, and discredit the person who's made the complaint, so that they go away, they drop their complaint, or nobody believes them as credible. You become like the Don Quixote tilting at windmills. Everybody looks at you and go, oh, there's that strange lady. You have to be able to find the channels to fight back, and that's hard if you don't even know what laws apply to your case, because you yourself are not a lawyer.
I'm putting a book in the chat. Willful Blindness by Margaret Heffernan. It was kind of a life-changing book for me. I wish I had read it before I used the alert line. She has a story in there about the Libby, Montana. It ended up being, I think, the largest Superfund site in the United States. And, it was a woman that she was kind of like the crazy lady. The people in the local grocery store is like, oh, there she is, hide from her. And it was one person, I believe it was a journalist. And, journalism is going through such a rough period, but investigative journalism, oh my, support them so much. But can you imagine what it's like when you're just like, for her, this woman in Libby, Montana, she saw that the town was being poisoned and everyone called her crazy lady. And it took one person, I believe it was a reporter in Seattle, who dug into it, and it ended up being the largest Superfund site. So I love Willful Blindness by Margaret Heffernan. The other thing is, if you guys aren't familiar with her, there's a TED Talk on super chickens that she does that is so good. So I'll put that in the chat too, about her super chickens TED Talk, because it's so good. And if you've been in a situation where you are around super chickens, meaning, just think Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk in a room. Think how that's going to end up.
Just jumping on your comment on investigative journalist, like at the time, it never ever crossed my mind that I could actually go and speak up to a journalist, because for me it was, oh, my name's going to be on the newspaper, like that's a no-no. But I got to actually work with investigative journalists, and like you, I guess, Kelly, I've got a ton of respect for those individuals, because they would do whatever it takes to protect their sources. But I guess most people don't want to go to a journalist. Like, that's not the first thing you want to do as a whistleblower. You actually want things to stay in-house. Like, you want the problem to go away, but you want that to be dealt with in the organization. You don't want to make any noise. That's what I guess people first instinct is about. And that's also why I didn't want to call a third-party hotline provider in my case. I wanted that issue to be dealt by my company. But if people don't have a choice, and the problem is just too big, or it's the top management of the organization that's involved, and you have only one way, which might be an investigative journalist. All of the investigative journalists that I've dealt with in the last 9 years now, I've got a ton of respect for them. But before I became a whistleblower, I was scared to death about speaking to a journalist, because for me it's like someone that's going to put my name all over the media. Mm-hmm. But there's journalists and journalists.
Yeah. Yes, we had a whole panel yesterday talking about how do you find the right reporter, and and do you go public with your story? And I think that sort of goes back to, so if you're going to be anonymous, you certainly are not going to go to a reporter. But if you really feel like there's a greater good and real harm to a community, then you might feel more compelled to not be anonymous and try to do something about the contamination. I think our one of our award winners yesterday, Shannon Becks, that's what she did while being in active duty in her uniform. she said there was contamination at Pearl Harbor on the base, and she spoke up about it. I hope we get to hear more of her story. But her name, we Googled her, and her name popped up, and you think, oh my gosh, that has to be scary and risky. I know the first time I ever talked to a reporter outside of it being something that, and I'm lucky that I had the experience of having worked with public affairs officers who shepherded me through a process, who knew to say this is on background, or, this is non-attributional, but you can say it's, a senior official inside the Pentagon. How do you really negotiate that as well as you're thinking about, do I want to be anonymous, or do I want to really, or does the public really need to know this? And without sort of a lot of that training and background, or even having that training and background, the first time I did it, the first time I picked up the phone and called a reporter that I had known, that I had worked with before, and I said, I'm calling you right now off the record because I have something I think you need to know about. I was terrified. It was really frightening. And just trying to get stories out, and we're going to have another session later today about going to Congress. I think that's the push-pull, and knowing when you're a protected whistleblower. Obviously, going to the press, you're rarely a protected whistleblower, or going to Congress or other elected officials. Other countries have different rules about this. Is that a protected disclosure? And then what happens when you do make a disclosure and you walked into your boss's office, I walked into my boss's office, it never occurred to me to say I'm anonymous. You have a French accent, I have a subject matter expertise that there was only a handful of people in the Pentagon who would have known about. It's that, I think it becomes that water cooler conversation. Like, people know who the whistleblower is. I think even as much as you want to stay anonymous, it rarely happens. And then you're subject to the retaliation. So I think, how do you protect yourself down the road, even if you've been anonymous or not anonymous? How do you protect yourself from the retaliation?
I think partially going public, if you choose to. I know a case recently where one person came forward, and now the attorney has 8 more clients from this one place. So if you get it out there, I sometimes think that can kind of protect you. It can validate you, because someone sees that someone came forward and went, hey, that happened to me too. Mm-hmm. So, I love Twitter. I love Twitter. And again, the journalist being able, and the lawyer speaking for you. So, maybe at first you're not comfortable with your name out there, but eventually if your name does get out there, lots of times other people come forward. That happened, it's happened at many companies where one brave person came forward and then they're like, hey, this happened to me, or I saw this there too. So sometimes that being public will protect you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it has that mixed bag effect, right?
When you talk about going public can help, I guess another example that's got nothing to do with that is, victims of sexual harassment. Usually takes decades before, those matters come to the surface, but it only takes one person to have the courage to speak up. And then you usually have dozens of other victims that will come, in the next few days or weeks after that. And it relates to, I guess, 3 feelings that we have when we blow the whistle. One of them is fear, and we all have that fear. And others more around, I guess what we call HR-related matters. So bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, things like this are shame and guilt, and these are the feelings that are preventing people from coming forward. I definitely had the fear of speaking up myself, whether I was right or wrong. I guess that fear was there, and then the guilt of potentially putting someone behind bars was also something that really I felt really deeply. But for victims of sexual harassment, definitely the shame, knowing that as soon as they speak up, everybody's going to be made aware of it. Their loved ones and their colleagues, and that's terrifying to be able to face that. But as soon as one does speak up, other victims are likely also to come up and speak up, which then will, I guess, help in a way the case, because if you're by yourself, it's I guess harder to win that case potentially. But if you've got other victims that come forward and tell the same story, then you've got a better chance to, I guess, win that case and try to heal the pain and move forward.
Yeah, I've only worked with one case where there was a group of whistleblowers. Usually it's a single person. I couldn't imagine how comforting that must be to have like a group of whistleblowers who have joined together. That seems like it would be a real blessing to have that many people that could kind of share the burden. So, and I have about 15 more minutes. I think we answered there was one question that I saw come in, and I've seen lots of comments in the chat. And I think we did get the one. I think we've addressed this question already. Are there any other questions? I want to give people, again, we've tried to encourage audience participation, because we know that this is an opportunity to really interact. We want to include the peer-to-peer connections, to make the contacts. I'm sorry, Brenda wasn't able to join. I don't know, Kelly, have you ever talked to her about insurance and the advantages, or what do people need to know about having professional liability insurance?
I have not talked directly with her about it. The financial ramifications of being a whistleblower. I coach and mentor a lot of young early professionals, and I always say you need to have the walk-away fund, and you have to be able, and I've said this to my children because they're early young professionals. You always have to have a walk-away fund, because I've never been asked to cross the line, but if I did, I could just leave. It's really important to, if you see something and you know that it's potentially you're gonna lose your job because of it, I'm gonna say prepare for it. Like as best as you can, prepare for it. It's hard as a parent of kids to say, mom or dad lost their job and we did the right thing. It's a hard lesson for children to learn at a young, and Sylvain, you had young children, you had, mouths to feed. Like you said, you had a good degree, you could have gone and gotten another job and everything, but sometimes the economy doesn't allow for that. And again, I don't want to go on the judgment side of, well, that person didn't come forward because they were chicken. It's just, But
it pays off to speak up, and you're right. I think having the getaway fund is important. I guess I'm born as an entrepreneur. I sold a teapot to my grandmother. I was probably 5 years old, and she used it until her very last day, and it's now buried with her actually. And so from very early on, I had that willingness to kind of be self-sufficient. And so for me, yes, it was challenging, but I knew that no matter what, I would be able to find another job or start something on the side. But something that I was really proud of was actually 3 years ago, I was living in Boston. And so my kids born in Australia, landing in the US with their beautiful Australian accents, were kind of picked on, in the first few days at school. And for them, it was also the first experience on the yellow school bus that we saw on TV. When you live in France or Australia, but in the US, all the kids go to school on a school bus that's yellow and black. And one evening, my wife came back home and saw a Post-it note on the door. And it was my 11-year-old son that wrote a word on it saying that he got bullied by a boy from school on the school bus. And he found the courage to speak up, and he told me, "Daddy, you found the courage to speak up and to stop, a big fraud in your company." and I don't want to get bullied, and it was my way of kind of opening up and speaking up about this. So he had the courage of speaking up and not having that little boy, bully him for weeks on and not saying anything, because there was 30 other kids in the bus and no one said nothing because they just didn't want to be the next, in line. But for me, it was one great lesson, which is when you speak up, you also teach others to speak up. And for me, it was my son. And so in a way, I protected him, by doing what I did, 9 years ago, I guess. I'm hoping that this is what happened.
I think that's a great example of why we speak up, is because people follow in those footsteps. So one of my other questions that I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about the incentives to be a whistleblower, there's lots of international debate whether or not you compensate whistleblowers for, in the Quitom laws, Sarbanes-Oxley, there's a reward for whistleblowing in this country and in many other countries, as well as, my goal is for the psychosocial harm caused by retaliation, for there to be this mental health that, you can prove retaliation, not $10,000, not $20,000, but hundreds of thousands of dollars should be awarded to whistleblowers for their psychological damage. Kelly, you said earlier, it's life-changing. But what do you think about that? Should we be rewarding whistleblowers in any way?
Can I start, Kelly, because I'm a whistleblower? that has got a strong opinion on that. And I'm not from the US, so maybe different culture as well, but I hate the idea of thinking that I could have won some money because I spoke up. Like, this should be anybody's job. It was everybody should have said what I said, and I never deserved to make any money out of this, because it was said in my contract that if you see something, you say something, and this is what I did. However, it could have ended up really badly. I could have lost my job. I could have been, vilified and bullied and whatever else. And then I think receiving compensation, yes, for sure. And if that compensation is, my salary with CPI increase every year or whatever it might be, then yes, it should be that if I'm unemployable, for sure. If I'm being, psychologically impacted, yes, there should be a compensation. So for me, I don't like to think that people are whistleblowers because they want to win the lottery, because they want to retire early. That's not why they're whistleblowers. They're whistleblowers because they're good people and they want the truth to come out, and they want wrongdoers to stop what they're doing. But I don't think they want to win the lottery. But compensation, and that compensation could be in the million. It doesn't matter, as long as it's not, it's to compensate for what you've lost, and whether it's the impact on you and your family, or your financial situation, or the fact that you'll never be able to find another job. Yes, for sure, there should be a compensation, but I don't like to hear the word reward, bonus, bounty. For me, we're not in it for the money, and it impacts me. It pains me to hear that people might think that I could be in this for the money because I thought there was a financial gain.
So, though I totally agree, I don't think any whistleblower goes out and says, I'm going to get 30% or whatever. On the other hand, the idea that companies will only pay attention when it financially hurts them.
That is a really good point.
But in the US, in the stats might be out there, it takes 7 to 10 years for a case to settle. During that period, you'll be a wreck. Your life is going to be no life, and you're not going to have any money. And at the end, only maybe 1 in a million will get that reward. Everybody else is going to miss out. And it's really truly about winning the lottery. So I think the journey to get there is just not worth it. And yes, I agree with you, Kelly, that the companies will only kind of do something if they've got a stick, that's being moved in front of them. I think it's not worth it for whistleblowers. And I guess again, the analogy of you're in it for the money, I think is wrong. So for me, it's all about semantic and terminology. Let's call it a compensation scheme, and maybe that compensation should come, from the day you blow the whistle, so you're protected and your legal costs are being covered. And yes, if it happens that you were not a true whistleblower and you were part of that problem, then we'll recover the money one way or another. But I think there should be more support from day one. As soon as you're, a protected whistleblower, there should be compensation. There should be, support from day one, not in 7 years. That's far too late.
Oh, absolutely. I'm amazed how some people survive while these cases go on and on and on and on.
Yeah, it's inhuman.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's James Holzrichter, his story of going up against the defense. He was practically homeless with, I believe, 5 children at one point.
I was just thinking about him.
Yeah, he eventually got, the lottery, but over the years of time and the damage, he feels that they tried to take him out, and I believe that they did because so much money was involved. That's where I go to. Companies will only pay attention when it hurts.
Yeah,
and,
I agree. And we
but again, for me, it's all about the semantic. It's he got compensated. He didn't win a bounty because he was fighting, for truth, and he suffered for years. Well, there was no reason for him to suffer. So I think it's more around, I guess, the semantic. I think the financial, insurance or whatever you want to call it, should be there, but for me, it shouldn't be presented as a bounty because I think the perception from the public is that you're in it for the money. So of course, it's not helping, the overall image of whistleblowers to improve, because if you blew the whistle, it's because you wanted to make money out of it, or, you wanted, and for me, that's not why whistleblowers speak up.
And partly I asked that question because I do hear from people around the world. And I think I've seen articles up in Canada where they refer to whistleblower compensation as bounty hunting. So I wanted us to dispel that in this session, if we could have that moment, and to recognize that. I think you make a really good point that this goes on for sometimes decades, and people are out of pocket that whole time. I mean, that's why the professional insurance is always good to have from the beginning. But and you can only use that if you're a counter accused. You can't use that to bring your case in the first place. So the people that I've talked to that have had to sell a home, raid a college fund, I mean, these attorney fees and these battles, because you have to live off your life savings while you're unemployed as well, is astronomical. And again, it's universal. It's people all over the world tell me these same kinds of stories. That's why I see this so much like combat trauma, because it doesn't matter where a veteran has served, they go through the same impact and after effects. So Kelly, I'm going to borrow your question. Is there anything that you haven't told me that you would like to tell me?
I'm going to say that most whistleblowers, when they're in the midst of it, it is hell. But I think most of them, when they come out on the other side, they knew it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So just, and this community, Jackie, that you have created, and being able to reach out to other people who have gone through the same thing, I can't thank you enough for all the people out there that have resources that we didn't even have 5 years ago.
No, I'm hoping that we are making a difference.
Oh, for sure, no doubt.
Sylvain, do you have a last thought?
Yeah, I think for me, it's more for, whoever is listening out there that is working for an organization is don't be scared that people that speak up. Do embrace whistleblowing. I don't like that term, but I guess it will be there for for years to come. And don't think don't associate whistleblowers as a negative term. You should definitely facilitate those difficult conversations, because they're here to actually uncover hidden risk in those organizations, whether those risks are financial or linked to people or the environment or security, whatever it might be. And I guess you'll see the great value that your own resource, your own assets, which are your people, will bring to your business if you're more open, and if you don't judge when you receive those reports, but you actually are open and show humility and empathy to understand and review the facts, I think, as Kelly was saying before. But I can say, for the last 9 years that I've been deep in that world, that the more people speak up and the more they do it without fear and shame and guilt, the more value they bring to the companies.
No, and I see there is a question from South Africa about the lack of protections, including financial and security. Whistleblowers have been killed. Most recently, an assassination of a high-level government employee. What can be done in this case? Well, and my thoughts are to go back to what you said about making it public and getting more and more people to speak out and raise awareness.
We actually, in South Africa, we partnered with an organization called OUTA, O-U-T-A, and they're actually there to speak up about corruption in public companies in South Africa. So there are organizations out there that are helping people to to speak up safely. But I know a South African lady, Wendy Addison, she lives in the UK now. She can't go back to South Africa. She was threatened. She had to leave on the streets of London for a few months and rebuild a life from scratch. Again, so South Africa is one of those really tough countries where to speak up is not something you do lightly, and you should definitely do it only if you've got safe avenues to do it, and maybe get some support from an organization like OUTA, or maybe a law firm that helps and support whistleblowers. But it's not like speaking up in Australia like I did, where it was fairly safe, I guess, for me and my family.
All right, well, thank you. We are at 10:30, so we are supposed to go to break at this point and let everybody stretch their legs, and then we will be back. And of course, as Christian has mentioned and we've done yesterday, we're going to leave the session open, and if you want to have any kind of one-on-one, Christian is going to monitor the break, and then we come back at 11 o'clock for our part 2 on using your narrative with Congress to legislate change. And I've got some really exciting panelists coming on for that as well. So stay tuned and go enjoy your break. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yes, and thank you to both of you. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Hi, Mary.
So as Jackie said, I'll monitor the chat. If you put your hand up, I'll highlight you and I'll turn your mic on. And if the panelists want to stay for questions, they can, or we can just open it up for general discussion. It wasn't a hugely talkative group yesterday during the break, so I won't be offended if people are chatty.
I actually had a question for Sylvain.
Yes, is it Paul?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yes. My mic. I recognize your voice.
I saw that on our website, on the Workplace Promise Institute website, your company is kind of marketed as like owned by whistleblower owned company. Is that something that's marketable, or something that could be something in the future that might be like I guess a company you could trust more?
So I definitely put that as a key asset that we have, is because we know what we're talking about. And when I built Whisply, I actually didn't build it for the companies. I built it for the people within the company, and it was kind of our way to say, listen, if you don't have any reports